A few weeks ago, the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party released their 2018 election platform. The People's Guarantee, as they call it, is a platform of 147 promises, all costed out to give people what the PCs believe is a clear alternative to the current Liberal government. Now, there are plenty of reasons this video's taken so long to put out, many of them technical issues with my mic, but one of the biggest is that it just takes a lot of time to properly analyze this kind of document. Not only do you have to understand what the promises themselves are, the funding commitments and all that sort of stuff, but you also need to understand the history surrounding existing policies to be able to properly contrast this plan with the current direction of the province. However, after reading countless articles analyzing specific aspects and reading through the platform and making plenty of my own notes and observations, I think I can cover this plan pretty thoroughly. Let's start with giving the PCs the benefit of the doubt and covering the parts of this platform that are actually good. And yes, there are actually a lot of good ideas in this platform, surprisingly. First off, let's take a look at childcare, where the PCs want to give rebates to cover 75% of people's childcare expenses, as well as expanding childcare spaces by mandating any newly built schools also have childcare spaces, and drastically reducing time for approvals of new private childcare spaces. And on top of all that, they also want to improve funding for autistic kids and bring back the Children's Arts and Fitness Tax Credit. That's pretty much all good besides my concerns about what they'll need to do to achieve that drastic reduction in approval time for private childcare facilities. And since we're talking about schools already, let's look at their education plan, which involves requiring new school teachers to have experience with post-secondary math and training current teachers to grasp math better in order to improve math scores across the province. They also want to expand the financial literacy pilot program in high schools, which is something I've actually wanted to see for quite some time. And they want to improve accessibility by letting more types of people bring service animals to schools. Really, the only thing I question on the PC plan for education is the moratorium on all school closures, but even that seems like it's trying to get the review process to involve more community consultation, which is generally a good thing. Moving on to healthcare, this is where we find what's probably the best part of this platform. They promise to invest nearly $2 billion to build a comprehensive mental health system for this province, the biggest commitment to mental health issues in the province's history. They also promise a dental program for low-income seniors, 15,000 new long-term care beds over 5 years, and to give people more options for fighting cancer. Again, pretty much all good here, assuming they can follow through with it. But I'll get to my concerns on that front a bit later. However, I do have to start addressing other parts of their healthcare plan that I find concerning, primarily in regards to their horribly weak response to the opioid epidemic. Their plan to address this is a mere awareness campaign, and then for good measure banning pill presses for non-professional usage. This is not nearly enough, and anyone with an ounce of knowledge on the issue will tell you that. Also, they only plan on following through with the current government's plan to give pharmacare to people under 25, as opposed to one of the few promises we've seen from the NDP, who plan to expand to universal pharmacare. I mean, at least they're not cutting it back, but I'd like to see more action on this front. In a similar vein, I'm not a huge fan of the PC housing plan, mainly because it's mostly focused on cutting red tape, i.e. deregulation, and smaller measures like selling air rights over provincial transit stations and giving municipalities less time to make decisions on housing projects. Not that these are inherently terrible ideas, it's hard to tell without very specific details and some of them could go either way, but regardless, they're not sufficient for the problem they're trying to address. There also seems to be a lot of infrastructure talk in this platform. $100 million in funding for cell and broadband infrastructure projects, $70 million extra into helping fund municipal projects, and a ton of funding into transit projects, especially in the GTA, where there's a planned $5 billion being put towards subways alone. Other transit highlights are fulfilling commitments to all-day GO train service and completing the environmental assessment on the Windsor-Toronto high-speed rail project. And since we're talking about how people get around, the platform also promises a $500 winter tire tax credit and plans to end what it calls geographic discrimination on car insurance. Besides this being a little too focused on the GTA for my tastes, most of these things are generally good, though the winter tire tax credit idea seems like pure vote buying to me rather than actual necessary policy. Also, to be fair, there are some plans to try and make life easier in Northern Ontario as well, so I can't really say the PC's only focused on one area of the province. That's odd. I've been really positive about this platform so far. almost seems like I think it's a good platform. Well, it's certainly not perfect, so let me explain some of the not so good stuff in here. First, let's look at taxes. As I'm sure you've noticed, there are a lot of spending commitments planned in here, so obviously they're going to raise taxes to pay for it, right? Actually, no. They're slightly cutting taxes on the lowest tax bracket, down from around 5% to 4.5%, and cutting them even further on the middle class bracket, which is dropping from a bit over 9% to just over 7%. This brings in my first issue, helping those who need it way less than those who are generally doing okay. That's offset a bit by increasing the sales tax credit, but to me that's still not enough. But okay, it's still mostly acceptable. So what about businesses? Surely they need some sort of tax increase there to help fund these plans. But no, they're not doing much there either. All they're doing is lowering the small business tax rate even further than Win plans to. So then where the hell is the funding for everything I've talked about coming from? Well, the answer is this nebulous value for money audit, where they plan to make over $6 billion worth of cuts in the span of 3 years, using the first year of their term to simply look at what they can cut. This is the shit I was talking about when I mentioned having concerns over things like the increase in long-term care beds in hospitals. While they claim these cuts are a conservative estimate in terms of waste they'd be able to cut, considering how past PC governments have run this province, I'm pretty damn skeptical of how that'll turn out. But those aren't the only cuts being made. Under the guise of changing how Ontario does carbon pricing from our current cap-and-trade system to the federal carbon tax benchmark, this platform promises another $6 billion in cuts over 3 years to green energy projects. Now, I'm not going to say that the Liberals have done a great job of overseeing projects funded by this, but scrapping the whole damn thing is going to majorly set the province back in terms of the green transition, and even the extra cost of the carbon tax won't be coming anywhere close to making up for that in terms of progressing on environmental policy. And that's before I even mention that I just don't think a flat carbon tax like this is as effective as cap and trade, which sets up actual targets to be hit and tries to limit emissions to meet them, rather than just hoping the tax disincentivizes the market enough to hit the targets. Not to mention the massive waste of time that will be dismantling the cap and trade program to set the province up for just having a carbon tax, which, by the way, is instead of funding those green energy projects, just going to be covering the tax cuts I mentioned earlier. Which isn't even a good way of framing this cutting green energy projects to give carbon tax money back to the people position, as paying less tax isn't going to be as noticeable to people as, say, a carbon fee and dividend system, which gives money back to people more evenly and more directly, and gives people something they can clearly see in terms of personal benefit. Also, while I'm angrily talking about taxes, I love how the PCs want to draw foreign investment into the province via a fucking tax holiday. All the good spending I mentioned earlier was making me wonder where the right-wing PCs we all know had gone, and I think we found them now. And speaking of being right-wing, there's one major win fuck-up the PCs really don't want to revert, and that's selling off Hydro One. Yep, no plans to buy that back. In fact, the only things they're doing on that front are following through with the current plan to buy people off so they don't notice the effects of this decision as much, and, even better, place an immediate moratorium on any new energy contracts just to make sure we're really screwed when they stop funding the green transition. The only thing that's even kind of positive in regards to energy in this plan is the promise to rein in executive salaries at public hydro companies, but even that really just amounts to virtue signaling, as does a good chunk of their plans to address corruption. Yeah, that Trust, Integrity, and Accountability Act? Not too many details on what it actually entails, but a lot of what falls under this plan seems to be just a bunch of symbolic gestures, like giving the Auditor General oversight on government ads. I do have to give them some credit here though, as the PCs are clear on cracking down on lobbying, specifically for officials who previously worked in a department they're trying to lobby, and they also plan on closing fundraising loopholes for cabinet ministers. Still though, not going to praise this too much without way more details, and we just do not have those details right now. Back to the environment for a minute. The PCs also promise to repeal the Green Energy Act eventually, and until that happens, find legal ways out of every contract related to that bill that it can. And just as the icing on the cake, they claim we no longer need the Drive Clean program, and as such want to scrap it. But let's look at the bright side. At least they want to clean up the Great Lakes and upgrade local parks. So that's something, right? Of course, the platform also has a bunch of promises related to jobs in the economy, which are a bit of a mixed bag. On the plus side, we've got some protectionism in punishing companies that receive government funding but then leave the province or cut jobs, and trying to get more people into skilled trades by promoting these opportunities better in high schools and doubling the funding for the Loans for Tools program. Then you have stuff that's a bit more questionable, like using tax credits to promote general growth, particularly in media and new startups, and speeding up the process to recognize foreign job credentials. Also in this vein, they want to slow down the increase to the minimum wage from $14 an hour to $15, even though that's not the part that had any chance of doing damage to the economy, and as such, it's more a symbolic gesture than anything else. As a side note, I'll probably do a video at some point discussing the whole minimum wage issue and where I stand on that philosophically, but I'll say that while I'm in favor of a living wage, I do think it should have been eased into a bit more rather than doing this massive jump in January 2018, then doing one more increase in 2019 to get that last dollar. Reduce that first increase to $13.50, add an extra step somewhere along the line. Just not this immediate jump that actually has a chance of causing a shock to the economy. But the real highlight of this plan is a certain policy taken right out of the Trump administration. For every new regulation introduced, they will be required by their own policy to eliminate 2 existing regulations. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the desire to cut regulations you feel aren't necessary, though I also don't think that you'll really find that many that aren't in some way necessary once you start looking at them. But even if you have this strong desire to eliminate regulations, this is a fucking terrible way of doing it. I don't understand why this needs to be explained, but since it clearly does, I'll go ahead and explain it. Regulations aren't just this abstract thing. They have effects, and getting rid of them also has effects. By assigning a strict number like this, you make it so every time some new situation comes up and regulations need to be established to address it, you now need to arbitrarily eliminate 2 existing regulations, which, with this sort of policy, you can't properly examine those regulations that are being eliminated to understand what the effects of eliminating them are going to be. Worse still is what this does for situations where there are already things you want to put more regulations on, such as this platform's plan to regulate financial advisors. Great, you want to bring them to heel. I'm fine with that. I agree with that. What I'm not fine with is arbitrarily letting loose some other beast because you had this stupid policy in place that didn't allow you to have the forethought to figure out what regulations it'd be safe to eliminate. The only way to do that is to establish ahead of time what regulations might be okay to eliminate. And if you're going to do that, why not just eliminate those regulations immediately? But if you are going to delay it to figure out which regulations you want to eliminate, then that just means you're going to end up delaying the introductions of these new regulations that may be very necessary for people's safety. So to sum it up, fuck this horrendous policy and any brain-dead moron who thinks it's a good idea. Almost done, let's look at the PC plans for justice issues. More judges, correctional officers, and probation officers, the creation of a fund to help families of fallen first responders, more funding for anti-gang and anti-gun task forces, and cracking down on human trafficking, which I honestly have trouble believing is a major issue in this province. Still, most of that is fine, or at least neutral. But there is one more policy to talk about here, and that's encouraging discrimination in housing against people who have served prison sentences. Now, to be clear on this issue, there's currently a loophole in place that actually gives such people priority in social housing, but the plan outlined in the People's Guarantee goes beyond just closing it and allows such people to just straight up not be let back in, even though they've already served their time for the crime they committed. And that is the People's Guarantee. Overall, it's a platform. It's not as bad as it could have been, but it's certainly not something motivating my leftist ass to go and vote for them in the upcoming election. As much as I like the funding for mental health services, some of the plans related to jobs and healthcare, and a few of the actual concrete proposals on addressing corruption, the things I dislike way too strongly to even consider this platform. I've already gone over them, but the 3 big issues I have are the cuts to green energy programs, which there are tons of in this platform, the 2-for-1 regulations policy, which is every type of stupid wrapped into a package and sent straight from the Oval Office, and just how nebulous this value for money audit thing feels. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and I don't think it gets more too good to be true than being able to find just enough government waste that you can have a balanced budget for 3 of the 4 years of your term. It feels super sketchy, and it seems very likely, given past behavior of this party, that when they inevitably don't find enough ways to cover the cuts they want, they will instead resort to service cuts that will leave the people of this province even worse off than Win will. Grading this, I'd give it a D+, maybe a C- if I'm feeling generous. I can't fail it because I really do like the mental health plan and a few other details scattered throughout the platform, but it's not something I'd vote for, and certainly not something I'm looking forward to being implemented if the PCs pull off a win this spring. Hopefully the NDP, or even the Liberals, put forward something much more palatable in their platforms in the coming weeks and months.